There's a few foods that people already know about that increase GLP-1 activity within the body, meaning it has an Ozempic-like effect. Just hit them flat out and then we'll get into the details because there's a lot more than just what I'll talk about here on the surface. Allulose, really important one, right? One of the most potent stimulators of GLP-1 that exists. That is a sweetener that comes from dates and figs. So you can get it in a concentrated form. You could eat some dates and figs, but it's pretty small amounts there. Obviously, protein is big, particularly from eggs. Fiber is going to be a big one, particularly soluble fiber. So things like glucomannan fiber, like shiitake noodles, chia seeds, flax seeds, things that have a high soluble fiber content are going to have a stronger potential for a GLP-1 effect. Antioxidants and flavonoids, right? So phenolic compounds that are in certain foods. So certain vegetables, it's not just about the fiber, it's about the actual phenolic compounds and how that influence GLP-1. One of the things that we need to know about though, and we'll talk about in this video, is how you can extend the benefit. So one of the reasons that GLP-1 compounds work so well is because they circulate for a long period of time. And we'll explain what that means in just a second. And after today's video, I put a link down below for one of our sponsors, Timeline Nutrition. If you're looking at metabolic and mitochondrial health, you do need to focus on the mitochondria. And Timeline is a product that utilizes what is called urolithin A. Okay, we've seen Dr. Gabrielle Lyon talk about it. We've seen other longevity experts talk about urolithin A because it induces what is called mitophagy. Mitophagy is where the mitochondria go through what is called autophagy, but specific to the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is where we produce energy, and when the mitochondria are dysfunctional, that is where metabolic conditions arise. Mitophagy is where the mitochondria basically breaks down decrepit components of itself to ultimately produce better mitochondria that are stronger. So it's a way to sort of envelop and sort of inside out mitochondria, if you want to put it like that, and create new mitochondria that can therefore process glucose better, oxidize fat better, and hopefully restore metabolic function to a certain degree. Urolithin A does this, but the problem is urolithin A, if you get it from pomegranates, one of the foods that has it, only 30 to 40% of the population will actually convert the urolithin A out of the pomegranate. So Timeline has used a patented technology called MitoPure that actually takes urolithin A and makes it bioavailable. So that link down below gets you 10% off Timeline Nutrition. So they have a berry powder and they have a capsule form. So again, that link is down below. I highly recommend it if you're trying to revamp metabolic health. One of the first things I want to talk about before we get into foods that can improve GLP-1, I want to talk about an oil out there. It's called Sacha Inchi oil. And I've talked about Sacha Inchi seeds before. That's not the focus of this video. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to talk about other foods and how you can do this. But I want to sort of highlight this because it's an interesting mechanism too. This first study was published in the journal Traditional and Complementary Medicine, and it is a rodent model study, but it's interesting because they gave rodents diabetes and they gave them Sacha Inchi oil. They found that Sacha Inchi oil, even when compared to an anti-diabetic medication, improved glucose levels, so it reduced hyperglycemia, it improved the response to glucose, it improved pancreatic beta cell function, it improved the amount of insulin that was able to be produced, and it also restored some of the atrophic pancreatic islet cells, which means these are the cells that sort of start the process. So bottom line is that Sacha Inchi oil has an interesting effect. And one of the reasons why it does this, see, I told you I had a point, is because of its potential influence on GLP-1. So if you look at the GLP-1 literature, you see very similar things. GLP-1 is sort of restoring insulin function, and that's how the metabolic health piece comes into the equation. Where it's unfortunate is that people in Hollywood and whatnot, they're using Ozempic just for weight loss, when in reality it should be for people that are dealing with serious metabolic conditions because it is quite a powerful metabolic restorer. And for people that are obese and diabetic, they might even need this stuff. So it's frustrating when people that just need to lose a few 5 to 10 glamour pounds are using it. I have serious issues with that because that's not where it should be used, in my opinion. Also sends the wrong message, and there's a lot of muscle atrophy that could occur. Going off on a tangent. Point is that if we understand that the mechanisms are really much more metabolic and even mental, because there was a study that took a look at humans published in Diabetes that found that when they were given a GLP-1 receptor agonist, their brain didn't even respond the same way when looking at pictures of food. So it actually changes how we see food. But the biggest, most important piece is the reason these compounds, these drugs work is because GLP-1A is going to come in at a much more potent degree than what you would get out of food, but it's going to circulate for a longer period of time. So when it circulates for a longer period of time, it has a chance to have an impact on metabolic health, not just from eating some fiber. But one of the things that we've seen recently in the literature, and I've talked about this in some recent videos, is an enzyme that is called DPP4 that is produced within our gut. So GLP-1 is produced as a gut incretin, a hormone in our gut. It's not technically a hormone, it's a peptide hormone, but it's produced in our gut. And then we have this enzyme that is released subsequently that actually shuts off GLP-1's function after 1 or 2 minutes. So it basically sends the signal to the brain and it has some effect on glucose and then it shuts down. So if we can reduce what's called DPP4, we can actually prolong the half-life of GLP-1 within our body, which means that we can get ourselves closer to having the same effect that we would have from a compound like Wegovy or Ozempic. When I say closer, I don't mean anywhere near it, but I mean a heck of a lot closer than we are otherwise. So the way that we do that is by eating foods that can have this potential. I mentioned Sacha Inchi before, but I'll mention it again because we've now seen some literature published in the journal Science of Food and Agriculture that actually found that Sacha Inchi protein hydrolysates, so the protein compound in Sacha Inchi seeds, which we've seen in some other nuts and seeds, by the way, but most profound in Sacha Inchi seeds, has a huge effect on inhibiting this enzyme, DPP4. So basically it turns the enzyme down so GLP-1 can act longer in the body. So GLP-1 is induced because of the high fiber content and the high protein content of Sacha Inchi, but then it has an effect on DPP4. I've personally noticed that with Sacha Inchi seeds and some other seeds, more than nuts, definitely more than nuts, that I have a very, very curbed appetite afterwards. And I like the fatty acid profile of Sacha Inchi seeds because it's much more alpha-linoleic than it is linoleic acid, so it's much more omega-3 skewed. The other thing that you can do is anytime you have something like allulose, which is, again, very strong at signaling a GLP-1 response, is combine it with like some orange peel. Another one that's extremely potent is going to be curcumin, because these are other DPP4 inhibitors. And I've talked about this in another video, but curcumin can inhibit DPP for 24 plus hours. So just a couple curcumin capsules, like maybe 1,000 milligrams of curcumin or something, can have a huge impact. You can also just put it on your food. So by actually having like, maybe if you had rice and you added some fiber or protein with the rice and curcumin, it's going to attenuate glucose. And it's interesting because we see this in cuisine that has more curcumin anyway. Those cultures tend to have a little bit better blood glucose levels, interestingly enough. The other one that's quite interesting are going to be mollusks. Now, when you look at mollusks, you're looking at clams, you're looking at mussels, you're looking at things like that. Now, what's interesting is that these also have a high amount of zinc, which could be very, very good for appetite and also hormone function to begin with. So that's great. You also have a nice mineralization, you have selenium content, and you have gram for gram some of the highest quality protein that you can get. The amino acid profile of mollusks is great, but then you also have a DPP4 inhibition. So the takeaway when we want to look at like what kind of foods we should look at consuming, high protein, high fiber. I don't recommend trying to induce a GLP-1 response via fat, even though it can be done. You're going to consume so many calories trying to do it that you're going to miss the forest for the trees, and you're probably just going to consume too many calories anyway. So lean in protein and lean into fiber, and then sort of instigate this DPP4 inhibition with curcumin, with orange peel, with grape seeds. You could literally do a Google search on foods that inhibit DPP4, and you could probably come up with a whole other list. But that is the most important piece that is missing. The most important piece is elevating GLP-1 and eating wholesome food. But the important piece that's missing is how can we prolong the half-life of GLP-1 in our body. And some people are probably wondering, okay, I'm taking a GLP-1 receptor agonist. If I were to consume these foods, would it make it work better? The answer is no, because when you're taking a GLP-1 receptor agonist, it's subcutaneous. It's not contained within the gut like it is short-term with a food response where this DPP4 can have an action. So when it's actually used as a compound, it's a different story, which is again why it works so well. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.